Hello everyone. Wishing you all good health, peace, and the kind of love that finds its way back, no matter how far it has wandered. After facing countless dangers and walking the edge of fate, CEO Hung finally returned. Tired, scarred, but alive. And waiting for him was Tieu Ca, the woman whose heart never stopped beating his name. The moment their eyes met, time stood still. She ran to him, her voice trembling with emotion, and for the first time, she let it all out. The love, the fear, the sleepless nights, and the prayers whispered into the wind. "I thought I lost you," she cried. But he was home now, and her heart was whole again. A remote autonomous region, under Chinese control, had been struck by a horrifying accident, one that shattered lives and buried secrets in the shadows of the forest. Hung, once a powerful man, now hunted and wounded, had no choice but to disappear. He wandered the forest alone for days, evading danger with nothing but sheer will. He ate leaves, drank from stagnant puddles, and tried to stay awake through the piercing cold of the nights. But even the strongest have their limits. One morning, his legs gave way. He collapsed by a river, unconscious and barely alive. When he came to, pain wrapped around his body like chains. His shoulder burned, his lips cracked from thirst, and every breath felt like glass. As the foggy dawn broke, he heard dogs barking faintly from afar, and the creaking of a boat approaching through the water. He forced his swollen eyes open. A dark-skinned old man stepped off a small wooden boat, his face weathered like the riverbanks. It was Mr. Sos, a local fisherman known along the border for his quiet resilience. Seeing the lifeless figure on the sand, Mr. Sos rushed forward. He checked for signs of life, a heartbeat faint, but there. Without hesitation, he hauled Hung onto his boat and paddled through the misty river toward his humble hut nestled by the jungle's edge. In the nights that followed, Hung was nursed like a broken bird. Mr. Sos cleaned his wounds, fed him warm rice porridge laced with herbs, and helped him fight off a fever that nearly claimed him. Hung didn't speak for days, but when he did, his voice trembled with urgency. He told Mr. Sos everything about the smuggling cartel, the illegal timber operations, the betrayal from within, and how he had become the hunted. His escape was not just a matter of survival, it was to protect something far more sacred: his family. Mr. Sos's expression turned grave. "This place," he said, "is no longer safe for men like you. If they find you, they won't spare your life a second time." When Hung was finally strong enough to walk, he begged Mr. Sos to help him return to Vietnam. The old man led him to a hidden path, a narrow trail choked by vines and silence, winding through forgotten lands. It was dangerous, but it was his only chance. Hung bowed deeply. "I owe you my life." The journey was brutal. His shoulder throbbed with each step. Hunger clawed at his belly, and exhaustion blurred his thoughts. But he never stopped. He couldn't. He had to return to Tieu Ca, to their child, still fragile in an incubator, still waiting for his voice. Some nights, he hallucinated her. He heard her sobbing in the wind, saw her silhouette by the trees, felt her warm hand in his. Those visions kept him alive, and then at last he saw it. A weather-beaten sign that read, "Vietnam border to 2 kilometers." He fell to his knees. Tears spilled down his dust-covered cheeks. He had made it home. At the border station, officers gasped at his condition. He was treated immediately, and through trembling fingers, he called Tieu Ca. The moment she heard his voice, she dropped the phone. Her legs buckled. "He's alive," she whispered, before breaking into sobs that seemed to shake the walls. That night, Hung returned. The door barely opened before Tieu Ca hurled herself into his arms. Her hands trembled as they clung to his torn shirt. She cried into his chest deep, desperate sobs that came from nights of fear and empty prayers. Little Anne ran toward him, clutching his legs, her small face radiant with joy. Hung couldn't speak. His throat was choked with tears. The pain in his body vanished in that moment. He was home. They were safe. From thousands of miles away, Mr. Peter Nyan received the news. A strange silence settled over him. The man he once doubted had crawled through death itself to return to his daughter. Perhaps this wasn't mere affection. Perhaps this was something far greater. Peter Nyan said nothing. Not yet. Not now. He chose to observe quietly, at least until the storm in his own heart had settled. Days passed. Hung healed slowly, and Tieu Ca was always by his side. She made broth from roots and herbs, fed him with a spoon when his hands were too weak, whispered love into his ear when he trembled in his sleep. She no longer hid her feelings. Her eyes followed him with tenderness. Her hands touched him with reverence. One night, while brushing sweat from his forehead, she whispered, "I thought I lost you. I prayed every night. I would have given anything, just to see you again." Hung took her hand. "You're the reason I survived." And he meant it. When his strength returned, Hung took Tieu Ca and little Anne to the hospital. Their newborn was still in the incubator, but her cheeks were flushed with life. The doctor smiled and said, "She's breathing well on her own. She's growing stronger every day. Soon, she'll be ready to go home." Hung placed his hand over Tieu's circus. Her tears flowed freely. In the quiet stillness of the hospital, surrounded by beeping machines and the fragile breath of new life, they found peace. Little Anne looked at her sister through the glass, then back at her parents. Her face sparkled with joy. That night, they went home hand in hand. The world had broken them, hunted them, and nearly torn them apart. But love, steadfast, bruised, and relentless, had brought them back. Together, they would build a future. One storm had passed, and a bright dawn awaited. Days passed, and peace slowly returned to their small home. Hung, still bandaged and healing, began helping Tieu Ca with small things, peeling vegetables, folding laundry, cradling little Anne to sleep. Their lives felt fragile but warm, like a delicate thread of hope quietly weaving them closer. Yet deep inside, Hung knew it wasn't over. The cartel wasn't just a passing danger. He had seen their faces, heard their threats, and worse, he had the evidence. A USB drive hidden in the seam of his jacket, containing photos, coordinates, and transaction logs of the illegal timber operation. It was the kind of truth that could bring powerful people to their knees or make a family disappear overnight. That night, as rain softly tapped against the roof, Hung sat by the window. Tieu Ca walked over, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "You're thinking about them again," she said softly. He didn't answer at first. Then, without turning, he whispered, "They'll come for me. Maybe not today, but soon." She kneeled beside him, took his hand, and said firmly, "Then, we face them together." Hung looked into her eyes, those same eyes that had held him through storms, and silence, and nodded. He couldn't protect her by hiding anymore. In a high-rise apartment in Singapore, Peter Nyan stared at a video call screen. His daughter was glowing, her arms wrapped around Hung. In the background, little Anne laughed while holding a tiny pair of socks meant for her baby sister. Peter's throat tightened. He had been silent long enough. "Book me a flight to Vietnam," he told his assistant, "as soon as possible." Hung visited the local police to hand over the evidence. The captain's expression changed from disbelief to shock as the files loaded. Photos of illegal shipments, names of corrupt officials, footage of violent attacks. This wasn't just a local crime, it stretched across borders. "We need to move quickly," the captain said. "Your life is still in danger." That night, an unmarked car parked on the edge of the village. Two men in black observed Hung's home through binoculars. One of them lit a cigarette. "He's alive," the man said coldly. "We finish what we started." 3 days later, a car pulled up in front of the house. Tieu Ca opened the door and froze. "Dad." Peter stepped out, gray-haired, tall, carrying no luggage. Just his old briefcase, and a tired look in his eyes. She didn't know what to say. Too much had been left unsaid. Too many years of silence. But then he opened his arms. And she ran to him. Hung watched from the doorway, his chest tightening with uncertainty. Would Peter accept him? Or would his presence reopen old wounds? But Peter slowly walked forward and said, "Thank you. For protecting her. For surviving. For being the man I didn't believe you were." Hung bowed his head. "I didn't do it for forgiveness, sir. I did it because I love them." Peter placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that's why I'm staying. To help." The next evening, while the family was preparing dinner, a stone shattered their window. Hung rushed outside, but the street was empty. On the ground lay a torn piece of paper. "You should have stayed dead." Hung clenched the note in his fist. The past had found him. Tieu Ca appeared behind him. "We need to go." "No," he said. "We don't run anymore." Peter stepped forward. "Then, let me help. I still have contacts, judges, journalists, good men." Hung looked at the man who was once his greatest obstacle, now, perhaps, his only ally. "We fight," Hung said. "For the truth, for our children." A life lesson from the journey of Hung and Tieu. Life is a journey marked not only by joy and triumph, but also by hardship, fear, and the unexpected trials that test the human heart. From the perilous forest escape of Hung to the quiet strength of Tieu Ca, this story teaches us something deeper than mere survival. It teaches us about resilience, love, and the quiet power of faith in one another. Hung's journey reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to keep going even when the path ahead is dark and uncertain. Wounded, hunted, and nearly broken, he pressed on, not for fame, not for glory, but for the people he loved. That is perhaps the most profound kind of bravery, the courage fueled by love. Tieu Ca, on the other hand, teaches us the strength of unwavering hope. Even when news was scarce and fear clouded every day, she held on to the belief that Hung would return. Her heart was full of longing, but never bitterness. Her love was quiet but unshakable. Sometimes, it is this gentle, persistent kind of love that becomes the strongest anchor when everything else seems to fall apart.